Hey everyone, this is our short video on the effects of conflict in the spread of HIV. By the end of 2016, there were over 36 million people living with HIV worldwide. Currently, sub-Saharan Africa is at the centre of the AIDS epidemic. With only 10% of the world's population, this region contains 67% of all people living with HIV or AIDS. Unfortunately, even nowadays, armed conflicts are still occurring in many regions of the world. In 2003, more than 72 countries were identified as unstable, and various conflicts have resulted in over 42 million refugees and internally displaced people worldwide. More importantly, these unstable conflicts increase the risk of disease transmission and infection, in particular HIV. The Declaration of Commitment on HIV and AIDS articulates strategies and goals to address HIV in conflict and disaster-affected regions. This declaration recognises the populations destabilised by armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies and natural disasters. These populations include refugees, internally displaced persons and in particular women and children, all of which are at increased risk of exposure to HIV infections. This called for HIV components to be factored into international assistance programmes where appropriate. In armed conflict, the spread of HIV can be mainly attributed to the movement of large groups of people. This includes both armies and the population displaced because of the conflict itself. The armed forces involved in conflict contributes to the spread of HIV. While the population prevalence of HIV is 9.5% in Africa, some studies estimate the prevalence in the armed forces as high as 27%. The armed forces usually contain a population of mainly young men who are prone to risky sexual behaviour and often associated with the commercial sex industry. The HIV prevalence of sex workers in Africa is as high as 73% in some areas. The refugee populations and displaced peoples associated with conflict also leads to an increase in HIV prevalence in the time following armed conflict. These people are exposed to social disruption, poverty and sexual violence and thus are at increased vulnerability to the disease. The movement of both these displaced people and the armies contributes largely to the spread of HIV within the community and to communities which were previously unaffected. These large-scale factors of moving populations aid the spread of HIV in secondary ways. Lack of education and awareness of the disease itself promotes its spread, and conflict disrupts efforts to educate the people. In addition to this disruption in education, any public health systems that exist are also damaged by conflict. Furthermore, breakdown in economic systems because of conflict hinder available wealth and further contribute to the spread of disease.
Now we're going to look at a case study involving community conflict and HIV. Conflict can be subdivided into armed and non-armed conflict. Our case study focuses on non-armed conflict.
In this case study, we look at an example of community conflict in rural Benue State in Nigeria. From mid-1999, the UK Department for International Development had been working in Nigeria to control and manage HIV and STD via clinics and community-based approaches. Despite their efforts and the efforts of the Nigerian NGO Academic Associates Peaceworks, a large-scale community conflict jeopardized the efforts to control HIV spread. The conflict began in 2002, sparked by a television documentary pointing to Benue State as the epicenter of HIV in Nigeria. Although the area had no access to television, rumours spread that their people had been damned by the documentary and conflict began. Tension rose between the aid workers, people living with HIV and other members of the community. Many felt that the aid money was unfairly benefiting the aid workers and that the people living with HIV had an unfair privilege in being able to access food and drugs. The conflict rose to threats of violence and isolation of both aid workers and people with HIV, to the point where they were dissuaded from visiting the health centre. By the end of 2000, 25 members of the HIV support groups had died, far higher than previous figures. This community conflict essentially halted the efforts to intervene and control the spread of HIV and AIDS in the Benue area, with fear and outrage eventually leading to the death and isolation of people with HIV without preventing the epidemic. Because of this conflict, potential measures to prevent community conflict have been investigated. A key intervention is community education on HIV and AIDS, as research has shown that many people in the Benue region had little or incorrect knowledge of the disease and a lack of education on how HIV or other STDs can be spread. These education programs not only help to educate the population about the prevention of the spread of HIV, but also help build trust within the community. In addition to community education, participatory monitoring and evaluation is also important in correcting issues that arise with giving aid. This allows continuous evaluation of aid projects with feedback leading to corrections. Bringing the topic of HIV a little closer to home, we looked at the conflicts within society here that may contribute to its spread. Thankfully, in Ireland, there is a lot of work done to help combat stigmas towards those who have contracted HIV. There are numerous information campaigns and seminars organised to stress the message that having HIV is not something which one should be ashamed or embarrassed of. The majority of the population, I'm sure, would agree that HIV screening and treatment regimens are portrayed in a positive, optimistic light here. However, there is an ever-lingering shame associated with HIV in Ireland. Even when you consider all that has been done to prevent prejudice towards HIV sufferers, it is somehow thought that those with HIV or those who have potentially been exposed to HIV have been involved in socially unacceptable behaviour. Here lies conflict within our own society which is potentially leading to the spread of HIV. Those who are at risk of contraction of HIV are afraid to be tested due to the stigmas and prejudices which surround the contraction of HIV in Ireland. To end on a more optimistic note, effective action and optimistic progress has been made in recent years. In 2003, UN agencies and NGO constituted an interagency standing committee reference group on HIV in emergency settings to coordinate actions in emergency situations. Guidelines set stressed the importance of multidisciplinary as well as multi-sectorial action. As a result, UN agencies have also supported comprehensive HIV prevention activities in peacekeeping missions in countries including Sierra Leone and the Dominican Republic. In Liberia, adolescent-friendly corners have been set up to provide a comfortable environment for honest discussion of adolescent concerns about HIV. The Liberian Red Cross and United Nations Population Fund works with many local NGOs to establish HIV prevention and education programs within camps for the affected population who have been stigmatized against. These ongoing actions reflect an increased recognition of the need to use integrated approaches to tackle these conflict-prone zones.